Deduction. A science and an art that has transcended all kinds of media. Obviously, you can think of literature. We have seen Sherlock Holmes, various members of Agatha Christie's characters, and countless others that I can't even begin to name. Through literature, it's also transcended into areas like television and movies. But through all of this, there is one surprising field that deduction is rarely ever touched upon. Video games. Why is that so surprising? Deduction is an interactive skill. Watching someone else do it, reading about someone else doing it is entertaining, but it doesn't give you the same satisfaction that you would get if you were to solve a puzzle by yourself. So then why don't many games touch on deduction? That's not because that there aren't games that use deduction, or deductive reasoning, critical thinking. Rather, they are so far and few between, the good ones often get lost in the cracks. Today, on Facts and Frauds, we're going to be talking about some of the best games that can teach you about critical thinking.
I wanted to talk about Professor Layton specifically today because I feel like he's an underappreciated character. Not in Smash Brothers! But we're here not secretly protesting that he's not in a game. I believe he is one of the best examples of deduction in the video game media. Aside from perhaps Sherlock Holmes' own games, there are others, but none would be easier to cover than Layton. But just who is Professor Layton? I suppose that is the point of this video, isn't it? Professor Layton is a Nintendo character made popular for his Nintendo DS game. An archaeologist, gentleman, and a detective to boot. You play through a series of puzzles in these games. Oh god, all the puzzles. As you work your way through the inevitable mystery that Layton and company have been tasked with solving, while Layton may be a larger-than-life character in a lot of ways, there is one thing that is actually pretty down-to-earth in these games. Considering they are designed to be educational, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that the emphasis on critical thinking would be taken very seriously. This is first obvious in the puzzles that vary in difficulty from incredibly simple to ridiculously complex and maddeningly convoluted. Despite that though, when the deduction aspect does arise, it is always within the realm of possibility, and so long as you've actually been paying attention to the developing story, it's not hard to keep up with. Of course, the deductions are still fictitious, but all things considered, they are among some of the most believable and realistic we have covered in this series so far, barring the ones that are set in reality like Joseph Bell and Arthur Conan Doyle, of course. But what makes Layton, in particular, such a great example to follow when it comes to being a deductionist? In short, it's things we've already discussed on this channel in the past. He puts an emphasis on using critical thinking to solve problems, encourages you not to jump to emotionally based conclusions without thinking it through first. Additionally, he travels with companions, Emi Altava and Luke Triton. These two companions play the role of assistant and protege respectively. But they aren't stereotypical bumbling Watson figures. They both play a role, learn from Layton, who teaches them both throughout their journeys. And with only a few exceptions, Layton sets the example of talking through his process as they happen. To answer why the Layton games are compelling and worth learning from for a deductionist, or puzzle solver alike, I need to ask another question. What does deduction, as you and I know it, involve? Deduction for us does not mean that you can call me to handle your taxes at the end of the year, but rather it is comprised of three distinct but connected thought processes: deductive reasoning, adductive reasoning, and inductive reasoning. This is a notion that can confuse some, but to simplify, we usually refer to these critical thinking processes as deduction, even though it's not technically an accurate term. Professor Layton is a master of all three, and he displays this through the many puzzles. So many puzzles, all of the puzzles. Luke, I just don't care about your puzzle. Anyway, joking aside, this game is literally thousands of puzzles between all of them. Some of them incredibly popular and others more obscure. Some to be solved at a glance and others that can take an eternity to think through properly. Though there are the occasional map puzzle, observational puzzle, or word puzzle, the majority of these puzzles fall into one of three categories: deduction, adductive, or inductive reasoning, or critical thinking, to use a more broad term. This is more than enough brain exercises to keep you busy and keep your senses sharp. And that right there would be the main thing that we need to take away from Professor Layton. In order to keep any of your skills sharp, you must practice them. And you cannot simply practice them in the same rut every day. You must challenge yourself in new and interesting ways to prevent yourself from becoming dull. Daily puzzles, observation practice routines, deduction puzzles, challenges from other people, and a training regiment are all brilliant ways to study these things. In short, what I'm saying here is not let yourself become idle when it comes to your personal training, but to keep what you do know being useful. Learning something isn't good enough if you never apply it. And while puzzles don't technically make you smarter, they do keep you from losing your abilities. The old adage rings true: if you don't use it, you lose it. This applies to everything you learn connected to this field. Observation can become dull, medical knowledge can become outdated, and trends change. If you become idle, you risk losing all of these things you've learned. So, do yourself a favor and create a training regiment. Make yourself a schedule for the days to work on your mind palace, your meditations, and for God's sake, solve a puzzle or something.
That should do it. Every puzzle has an answer.